Today is a very special day on the channel because we are going to have a much needed and necessary conversation that I would like to call God, Gays, and the Gospel, where we touch on the intersection of gospel music, gay culture, and its influence on popular music. And I couldn't think of anyone better to have this conversation with than world-renowned gospel music historian, archivist, author, and my friend, Tim Dillinger. Welcome to the channel, Tim.
It's good to be. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
I feel like when we talk about the influence on gay culture, on gospel music, and its influence on popular music, it's one of those things sort of like when somebody's in the closet and you're like, well, we know, but we're not going to talk about it, but we know it's there.
Well, there's a lot of unspoken. I was just actually reading an article today by, let me make sure I get this right, by Ahmad Green Hayes about Black church rumor, sexual violence, and Black gay gospel, and James Cleveland. And it was a really interesting article, and it kind of piggybacked on some of the writings that like Anthony Heilbut's done and other historians about the ways that rumor informs our relationship with the artist in gospel music. And so we hear things, we know, some people know things just because, gaydar is real, it's a thing. And so people sense things, and that creates this whole spectrum of story. I love what Bishop Yvette Flunder always says. She says there would be no gospel music without gay people, because ultimately, like, we created it. It's a art form that is so closely linked with gay culture, but also has schisms in relationship to gay culture. And so there's a respectability politic. I don't even buy the moral thing, but there's a moral thing that people try to silence around it. And sometimes if you're, most of the time, if your talent's great enough and you're not flamboyant enough, people will just kind of accept you and let you go by and let you have your career. And other people aren't capable of that. It's just not, either they're just not capable of it or it's not their desire. And so from that, we get some of the greatest, entertainers in soul music, disco music, R&B history. I mean, Sylvester was a child of the church, sang in the Los Angeles Community Choir, with Vermedia Royster from the Clara Ward Singers. I mean, this was like, before he became Sylvester with, the Hop Band and part of the Cockettes. And so there's this whole alternative gospel history that people are finally starting to acknowledge and talk about. But I don't feel like it, I feel like it comes out at its best when we talk about disco. I feel like disco and dance music is really where we get the full throttle story of gays in gospel, gays who came out of gospel, and disco music as gospel. I don't really see it as separate because so much of the output of the 70s just is gospel music. Even if gospel radio stations and gospel promoters didn't put these artists on their programs, it was gospel music to a disco beat accepted by a secular audience.
There's the disco period, but there's this period, particularly in like the 80s, the early 90s. It's like an interesting time in gospel where a lot of them are per se crossing over, but they aren't necessarily crossing over into the R&B or into the pop. When they say they're having these hits or they're crossing over, it's into the club and the dance worlds.
That's right. Well, there's two things were happening in the 80s. And so the first thing to look at, because the first 80s moment you get is for gospel, is the Clark Sisters, You Brought the Sunshine. And that song had like a long life from when it actually was first released to when it actually blew up on the chart, dance chart, to when it actually, how long it stayed on the chart and how long they rode the wave of that song. We're talking about like a 2.5 year period, ultimately, with another record that, and so this song kind of had a mystical life that you don't see particularly now with songs having shorter lives. I mean, to think about a song that sustained that long and took that long to build, it's kind of a major story. So the Clark sisters were a huge breakthrough, not a huge breakthrough in the sense of like what had happened in the 70s. So in the 70s, you had two groups that we actually know of. One was a quartet, the Mighty Clouds of Joy, and they scored their first disco hit in the 70s with Mighty High. And so that was getting like disco play before there was a disco chart. So you have Mighty High. And then in 77, 78, they have another couple of hits. There's Love in the World, In These Changing Times. At the same time, you also get the New York Community Choir. So the difference, and with Express Yourself, which was a huge hit for them. And then they had like a big turntable hit, which actually to this day, they did a song called I'll Keep a Light in My Window, which had been recorded by the Mighty Clouds of Joy, actually, like the same year. And a few other like inspirational artists. But the New York Community Choir had, to this day, it is one of their biggest streamed. It's more streamed than Express Yourself, which was their big hit. The difference with New York Community Choir and Mighty Clouds was they actually went into the discos. They didn't just say, thank you for playing us. We can't come to the discos because we're good, holy people. They said, we're going to go into the discos and touch the people. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to be with their audience. And so the Mighty Clouds and New York Community Choir both did that, much to the outrage of church people. The Clark sisters chose to not do that. And they actually did that rather publicly, which was very smart in the sense of they totally milked that controversy to help that song have more life. New York Community Choir did not acknowledge that there was any hubbub even going on. They were just kind of above the fray. We just are who we are and we do what we do, which doesn't help sell records. Mighty Clouds, they got a jet story out of it. They had a big fight with James Cleveland, or James Cleveland had a big fight with them, I should say, verbal, in Jet about their direction. New York Community Choir stayed very to themselves about it and just, did gigs, not just, they did Paradise Garage, they did Leviticus, David Mancuso's, the Loft. These were all places they went into, clubs all around the country, though. Clark sisters didn't do that. But You Brought the Sunshine was the bigger record of all of the crossover records. But after the Clark sisters, you get Tramaine, Hawkins, which to me is like the real story and the real continuation of what the Mighty Clouds and New York Community Choir began. And so Tramaine leaves Light Records, where she'd been since the beginning of her solo career. And she really desired to do something bigger, not out of step with, at the same time, what Amy Grant on the contemporary Christian side was trying to do with Crossing Over. Amy wanted to reach a broader audience, sing not so directly Christian songs. The difference, though, is that Tramaine really did not alter her message. And so when Tramaine released this, first it was the 12-inch single, which was Fall Down, which is like brilliant in terms of the branding. She had the fan. It was all really smart, because then the next year you get the record, the full length, and you get this on the back. So you understand how it all ties together. It's very smart. But Fall Down hit #1 on the dance chart, which had never, in 1985, which had never, ever happened before for a gospel group. And hits #1, and the church people, lose their poo. I won't cuss on the show, but they lose it. And all kinds of things. They said that there were backward messages embedded in the song about having sex, and just really just outrageous things. But Tramaine is like riding this wave because she's signed directly to A&M, which is the same label that has a distribution agreement with Amy Grant and Amy Grant's label, Burr Records. So she and Amy Grant are the two artists getting the A&M level promotion on their Christian/gospel product. So Fall Down doesn't stop there because Tramaine actually went into the clubs and started performing as well, which was really like people, I think they forgot that the Mighty Clouds had done this. I think they forgot that the New York Community Choir had done this because it was all brand new again. And she was so castigated for that. And you really see it when you listen to the second A&M record, Freedom, because it's much more downplayed. And she's still trying to do a dancey R&B thing, but there's like no energy in it. I mean, Fall Down, that whole record, Search Is Over, had 3 charting dance singles. 3. It wasn't just Fall Down. There was Child of the King, In the Morning Time. And you listen to those songs and you were getting an explicitly gospel album. There's no muted messaging. It wasn't even as muted as Amy Grant was. Amy Grant was very much like, let me sing a love song. Let me, am I singing about Jesus or am I singing about God? It's up to you. Tramaine was doing none of that. It was very clear. So Tramaine, to me, actually has the more significant record because of the cultural connotations attached to it. And I know you brought The Sunshine Gets deservedly a lot of love for its musical brilliance in the Clark sisters' performance. But ideologically, Tramaine, to me, has the most important record of those crossover records from the 80s.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Would you say it's because of Tramaine that we get the Vanessa Bells and the Vicky Winans going more into that route?
Totally. Well, in fact, some of this, at least one of the songs on Vanessa's first or second Jive record was a rejected song from Tramaine because they worked with the same people, Loris Holland. Loris Holland collaborated with Tramaine on The Search Is Over and Freedom. And one of the songs Tramaine didn't take, Vanessa took. And Vanessa, to me, took it a step further in terms of the boldness. Vanessa really did the more Amy Grant kind of record with You Bring Out the Best in Me. That was a much more indirect song. And I actually was just reading the other day where she talked about there's an ad lib at the end when you hear it. And she says, it sounds like she says, you really bring it out, boy. And she swears she said Lord and that it sounds like boy. And she said the church people really came for her about that. People were doing really bold things. So yes, Vanessa, Genovia Jeter, who, really should get a lot more, Glenn Jones' wife, should get a lot more attention for attempting to do gospel and R&B in one.
The Genovia record you're referring to from 86 with Take a Look.
That's the one.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a gospel record. It has love songs on it, but it's very much in the fashion of those crossover records of that time. An important record. She's important.
What I notice is the third through line in all of this is that these women are all charting with in the club or the music that's associated heavily with gay culture. So do you think the backlash from the church was because they knew that's who was buying up the music?
Absolutely. If in fact, I'll refer people to my God's Music Is My Life.substack.com, my feature on Tramaine. That's my argument, is that the outrage was about who she was singing to, because you also cannot talk about these albums and these songs and these women going and singing for the children without talking about it as the AIDS era, the era of the AIDS epidemic, which was quietly, destroying music departments in churches. And so it was also like raising to the forefront the church's hypocrisy around homosexuality in the church. And so, for a Tramaine to go into the garage and Studio 54 in the incarnation it was at that time was a huge statement that she was not making these lines of delineation, that she really did believe the gospel was for everyone. And she talked about the church's attitude towards homosexuality. And she said something to the effect of they would rather shun it than accept it. And she was accepting people and loving people where they were. And, when you read like YouTube comments on her videos for those songs, you read comments from people that heard, and New York Community Choir, both of them going into the clubs in those times was really significant for people, and it meant a lot to be extended love, compassion, understanding, and to get to be a part of that feeling that only gospel brings when they didn't feel accepted in churches.
What are some other songs from this period that you would say are reflective of that, that are gospel songs over a disco beat?
Well, I when I was getting ready for this, I thought about how many gospel artists um, played with disco, but didn't have the mechanism to get into the discos, like a Mighty Clouds of Joy, um, New York Community Choir, Tramaine. Those artists, again, were all on non-gospel labels who were bright enough and moneyed enough to know how to market them and where to market them. They didn't have a rule book telling them they couldn't go here. Whereas the gospel labels felt like they could not market into discos. In the 70s, Savoy kind of talked out of both sides of their mouth and said their artists wouldn't be interested in going into discos, but they would welcome disco play. You know, we'll take your money, but we won't come sit with you. And so they actually did, with one group, they marketed the Gospel Airs of Dayton, Ohio. God Helps Those Who Help Themselves. It was a minor disco hit from a quartet, a traditional quartet. So that's one of those songs to me. But there's also groups, 21st Century Singers. They did a record called Sunday Night Fever, as opposed to, Saturday Night Fever. And it had some cuts that were clearly intended for that audience. And they actually got like a great review in the Village Voice, but they didn't have the tools to get promoted in the discos. Gloucester Williams, Calvin Bridges and Spirit of Love. I mean, The Power of Your Love was it's become a disco hit now. A DJ rediscovered it, got it reissued. I really encourage people to look up Power of Your Love by Spirit of Love. I mean, it's an amazing record. Andre was flirting with disco. Andre Crouch. He had a song called I've Got the Best, had Philip Bailey come scream on it. It sounds like something Sylvester would have done when you listen to it. It's not that unlike Disco Heat in a sense. Reba Rambo, who was a white CCM artist with a black following, she did some great disco cuts, really influenced by the Pointer Sisters and Donna Summer and Denise Williams, that era. And another group called McGuire, a husband and wife team. They were a band kind of like a Ashford and Simpson kind of thing, did a straight ahead disco record with an 8-minute instrumental on it, but no promotion in the discos. So there were a lot of gospel people playing with the sound, and a certain segment of church people loved that because they could have something comparable and could even maybe sneak off to the discos, but they had gospel music that sounded like disco. So on that level, like, we owe disco a lot of credit because, Myrna Summers redid Aretha's Touch Me Up. Disco and gospel coalesced. They coalesced, but that's that same kind of tension I think you get with the gay congregants.
Then I think about the songs that are disco or gospel songs, but they didn't come from primarily gospel artists, such as like Alicia Myers, I Want to Thank You, one of the Two Tons' biggest hits, Earth Can Be Just Like Heaven.
Well, and can I interject there? Earth Can Be Just Like Heaven was written by Eric Robinson, who was a child of the church and was part of Gospel Music Workshop of America, who wrote James Cleveland's Give It to Me in 76. He wrote the lyrics for Earth Can Be Just Like Heaven. So you're absolutely right. It was a gospel song. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then I think it's just interesting because we have this period of like almost a decade long backlash, and then you have like that gospel house explosion that happens in the 90s. So like Adiva and Ricky Dillard go top 5 with Walkin', or Vanessa Mitchell Uh,
Sounds of Blackness.
mhm.
Sounds of Blackness. I mean, yeah.
Who else? Who's the one that sings "I get lifted up, I get lifted"?
Barbara Tucker.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it doesn't get any more
So
gospel than that. But speaking of all this gospel and the overlap of gay culture, heard you referenced him more than a few times of one of the originators, one of the leaders of this movement, and that is the New York City Community Choir. You're working on expounding upon this story and this project of this intersection between all of these themes. Could you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, very quickly, I'll tell this. I mean, I started working on this in 2014 as my thesis. I went back to school late in life, college, and knew I wanted to go to graduate school. And so right away, my advisor said, well, you're going to need to write a thesis. I said, well, I don't even have to think about it. I want to write about the New York Community Choir. I wanted their story because there was something in the sound of the New York Community Choir that was different. And you could say that might have been a little bit of my gaydar going off to a certain extent, but I knew they were free. I knew they were free. I found the choir's co-founder, Benny Diggs. He was their director as well. And I said, this is what I hear when I hear y'all. Why do I hear that? And he said, because that's who we were. And so that really began my trek, because I thought, okay, well, I at least know that I am free to explore these things. You know, they originated in the 1970 as part of the spiritual church, and they very quickly, they were politically attuned and interested. So they became a part of the Black Arts movement. They started a collaboration with Nikki Giovanni. They recorded 2 records famously with her, Truth is on Its Way and Like a Ripple on a Pond. And they did that work with her for, 3 years of making records, but also continuing to make their own records for a gospel label. But they were also Benny Diggs, Arthur Freeman, Wilbur Johnson, and Isaac Douglas, who were the original co-founders. They were very much interested in taking gospel outside of the church. So from the very beginning, that's what they were doing. They did it first with the Black Arts movement. Benny formed a subgroup called Revelation, which you can see here. I think I'm showing that. Yes, there's no glare. A subgroup called Revelation, and that was Arnold McCuller, Arthur Freeman, Philip Ballou, and Benny Diggs. They started performing in clubs as early as 1973 and started then getting into the New York session world. So they were doing sessions for like Carly Simon and Vicki Sue Robinson. They were on the original album that had Turned the Beat Around. They were doing background vocals on that record. So they were getting their feet wet with disco. They signed with RSO Records, went on a world tour with the Bee Gees in 75. And this is the subgroup. This is Revelation. And they got their feet wet in disco. They started doing the discos as a group. And in 77, Warren Schatz from RCA Records brought them on and said, I want to record you all like I would record any other group. I don't want to record you like a gospel group. I want to treat you like I treat my R&B acts. And they went in and did their first album for RCA in 1977, the album that had the hit Express Yourself. And it changed the game. And so you hear the next year they did a second record, Make Every Day Count, 1978. And they had a whole run in the discos. And you start to hear their influence. Shirley Caesar acknowledges when she does her First Lady record, which has like 2 disco cuts on it, that she's looking at the New York Community Choir. You know, she says that in Record World. She's looking at this new direction that people are going in, and she wants to replicate it. And you start to see smaller groups. One covers one of the Revelation songs on their gospel record. And you start to, hear nods to what they're doing, but nobody's taken that extra step and actually going in the clubs. And they did that. Arthur Freeman, who co-wrote Express Yourself, and again was the choir's co-founder with Benny, talks about the experience of going into the discos and meeting the children, meeting the people who were disenfranchised from the church. The choir came from a very open and affirming church. They came from what was originally Christian Tabernacle in New York. In the 50s, this church was having trans models. Trans people were completely integrated into the congregation. Mock weddings, women would wear men's attire, men would wear women's attire, and they would have a fake ceremony. And they were playing with all these things in the church. And so they had a very different experience than many church people. And so come the 70s, their church has morphed. It's now called the First Tabernacle of Deliverance. And they are employing disco in their worship services. So one of the songs everybody told me used to be part of their Sunday morning service was Armed and Extremely Dangerous. They rewrote it, gave it gospel lyrics. And so this is what New York Community Choir came to the table with, which is why I think they don't get, and in New York, they were very much branded as, you'll hear in the short, Arthur Freeman says they were branded as everybody was gay. Everybody was gay. They came from a gay church. And that really wasn't the case. They were not an exclusively gay choir. Their church was not an exclusively gay church. It was a church that welcomed and affirmed gay people, which in the 70s was still taboo. And so this is why I think they're so important. So this book is really about not just them, but their spiritual father, Bishop William Morris O'Neill, who created Christian Tabernacle in 1951. And how the choir's work was very much informed by what he created, and how, even though they went their separate paths when Bishop O'Neill moved to Los Angeles, and they remained under his covering as a pastor, a bishop, I should say, how those ministries modeled each other even when they were on different coasts and remained connected. And it's an amazing story. It's a sad story because, of course, the AIDS epidemic was devastating to the choir and the church. And so there's that part of the story that's not great at all, but it remains deeply important. It's interesting to hear how history gets repositioned, reintroduced, retold. And there have to be those of us that, are obstinate and headstrong enough to say, that's not what happened. Like my friend Craig Seymour is famous for.
Yes, much love to Craig.
I love Craig.
So, yes. So how can people support this project and support you?
Well, this has been almost a decade-long project. Next year, it will be 10 years. I've been talking with publishers, and I'm hoping that will happen. But the reality that I think people really need to know is that when we get these wonderful publishing deals, the reality is it's not a lot of money. It probably won't even pay a month's worth of expenses when it all comes down. And I'm just kind of honest enough to say that to people. This has been a project supported by the people. And I've got a GoFundMe. You can find in my link tree. You can Cash App me if you want to contribute. My Cash App is at $Tim Dillinger. The GoFundMe, you can link out from my Twitter. It's in my link tree. Facebook, it's on my page. You can link out to it everywhere. Instagram, there's a link tree that says contribute to the GoFundMe. I would not have been able to do this project without that kind of support. It is, as you know, the work that you do is costly, it is time consuming, and, pretty thankless in the big picture, but
Okay.
in the natural sense, but very much worth it in the spiritual sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I've been at it for 10 years. In those 10 years, I've watched a lot of my sources have died. Everybody's up there. Everybody's in their late 70s and early 80s for the most part. And so that's the hard part of doing these projects, is you develop heart to heart relationships with people, and they start to to go as time goes on. But I'm very determined. And Arthur Freeman, before he passed, he said to me, like, make sure our story gets told. And I'm staying on that. I'm staying on that because this is vital. It's vital history. You know, when I hear kids today, we should not still be struggling with people coming out in the church. We should not still be struggling with churches putting people out. We should not still have young people dying of AIDS-related causes, which they are, in 2023. You know, we need to do better in terms of educating people and letting people know they have always existed in these environments. And that's the real reason for this story.
And that's a great note to end on. So thank you so much, Tim. And to the viewers, Tim's information is in the description box as well as the pinned comment. If you love my work, you will definitely love Tim's because I've learned a lot from Tim. And I think before I even knew I was learning from before we even met. So
Wow.
thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you.
So yes, thank you. And I'll see you soon. We'll talk
That's right.
soon.
That's right. I'll be back in New York soon.
All right.